They would like more emphasis on country systems and less emphasis on operational policies and procedures of the banks. They want more focus on economics and efficiency, less focus on due diligence and impact assessment upfront, less focus on upfront costs and more focus on speed and moving projects along efficiently. The question is, how do we do that? How do we balance those needs? And I would suggest one of the things it means, and one of the dilemmas that all multilateral institutions have to be thinking about, is what does sovereignty actually mean in the world we live in today, both in economic and in political terms, and how do we navigate that in a new changing world environment? And one of the ways in which that has to focus itself in the multilateral development bank context is our borrower states being given the voice and the vote that they need in order to represent their own interests within the structures of the institutions. And are they properly designed to do that? So that's point number 2, with a lot of questions more than answers. Point number 3 is the impact of the operations in the member states, and particularly on the communities that are supposed to be the beneficiaries of member state government. You have to look. You cannot understand, for example, what the impact of climate means on a community and know how will they react when there's a flood or a drought. Will they move? Will they stay where they are and ask for assistance in doing that? But if you defer just to country systems, the answer to that gets lost. Because the government itself, and this is not it's inherent in the limitations of governments, not the shortcomings, but even in the best of governments, they can't possibly know what the communities on the ground always want. Communities may not tell them, they don't have the capacity to ask, but international norms and standards, which the governments have accepted, the international organizations have accepted, are pushing them to say, you have to know what's happening on the ground. And that's where impact assessments and consultations become really important. It raises all sorts of complicated, both economic and political questions. And just one indication of that, and the AIIB is clearly aware of this, is that the project-affected people's mechanism knows the risks of reprisals in projects is sufficiently significant that it's actually mentioned that there's a need for a policy to deal with the consequences of reprisals. So that's the third thing, is how does an international organization that is a member state-based organization, how does it deal with having to address the interests of communities whose interests might not be consistent with that of their own government? How does it balance that tension? So how does the international organization respond, which is my fourth point. And the first thing to note is that they have to pay attention to international norms and standards that have been developed in the international community and that are respected and upheld, supposedly upheld by the international community. That's numbered by all the stakeholders so that everybody understands how they can engage with the bank, when they can engage with the bank, what happens if they don't have the opportunity to engage with the banks. So that's number 1. Number 2 is more accountability. And it's accountability to all stakeholders. So that means accountability to the member states, and that's where the governance arrangements become important. It means accountability to clients, which means contractual arrangements are important. Accountability to investors, which is built into the nature of a development bank. But it also means that it has to be accountable to affected communities. And the affected communities are the most complicated because they don't have any kind of legal relationship to the institution. So that it's a non-contractual relationship. The organizations, all international organizations, are immune from legal process. So they can't be sued. But which means that in this new environment in particular, point out to the MDBs, is that under the law of immunity of international organizations, under a line of cases in the European Court of Human Rights, there's a line of cases that says international organizations can lose their immunity if they do not give an equivalent line, something equivalent to an effective remedy to the affected communities. For those of you who are lawyers, it's the Kennedy and Waite cases in the European Court of Human Rights. That's a mechanism that I suggest means that the independent accountability mechanisms in organizations like the AIIB need to be as effective as possible. And that brings me to my last point about the function of accountability in international organizations. And the first point I want to make is it's not about blame. The reason you need accountability is not just to mitigate harm, but it's because the dealing with the environmental and social consequences of projects we don't know how to do it. The human knowledge hasn't yet advanced to the point where we truly understand how to manage these issues. And so even if you assume the most competent, the most professional, the best intentioned staff in an international organization, they are inevitably going to make mistakes because they can't know what the future is and they can't understand how a project is fully going to impact in a particular area. And so the purpose of the accountability mechanism is to mitigate unintended harms that might happen, but equally importantly, to make sure we learn the lessons when things go wrong and that we can try and avoid committing the same mistake in the future. That's number one. Number two, the reason to have an accountability mechanism is it offers a unique perspective to the international organization. Everybody else, the member states, the clients, because of their legal relationship, have a way of communicating with the organization and expressing their concerns to it. Affected communities don't. So having a community-driven mechanism gives a perspective that it cannot be gained in any other way. And that's really an important perspective, particularly as environmental and social issues become more important in an organization. So that's the reason to have a mechanism, but it's also important that the mechanism is credible and that everyone has confidence that it will actually deliver some sort of a result, which doesn't mean the community should win. It means that the mechanism will investigate independently and coming to a report that is acceptable and credible to everybody. The challenge of credibility is not to being credible is not an insignificant problem. And for this, I want to use my own mechanism. I'm a compliance officer in the Social and Environmental Compliance Unit at UNDP. And from there, I can see some of the problems. One of the inherent weaknesses of an accountability mechanism in a development bank is that at best, it reports to the board. We know that reporting to the board can never be a completely independent mechanism. It's independent of management, but it's not independent of the institution. So that it means that the transparency and the way in which it works has to be protected and preserved and respected in some way. It's tempting in some ways, and this is partly the case in UNDP, to see the issue as an operational issue for management. But the accountability mechanism is really much more than that. And so it should be independent of line management functions to be seen as credible. Second thing is there's a risk when you mix functions between accountability to communities, accountability or auditing functions, which often happens, to evaluation functions, which happens. And the reason for that is there's a difference in culture. Auditing and integrity functions, by necessity, have to have discretion. They have to be confidential. They operate, whereas a mechanism that's dealing with communities, external stakeholders, has to be open, it has to be transparent, it has to be easy to access. It's a completely different culture, and mixing them has a risk of undermining both functions ultimately. Similarly, if you mix evaluation with accountability, there's a risk that what happens is the accountability mechanism, which is investigating projects in real time, reaches a decision which, when evaluation comes up, requires the evaluation unit to sit in judgment on the judgments made by their colleagues in the accountability mechanism. And again, that creates a tension and risks undermining credibility in the mechanism. So to conclude, because those are the 5 points, and I think I'm about out of time, is to say the accountability mechanism is there really as a friend of the institution to bring lessons learned, to mitigate harm, but also equally important, and to just stress this last point, is one of the things it does is when it finds out that there's been a problem, and it says you need to adjust the project to compensate the people for the harm they've suffered, really what they're saying is you miscalculated the true costs of this project. You underestimated some of the costs, and all that this is really telling you to do is to accurately reflect the true costs of this project, and therefore to better understand the benefits of the project as well. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Hello? Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Danny, for this very compelling and exciting, tour de table of the menu that we need to follow. I think perhaps now the audience, can understand why some 30 years ago I took your class, and I don't regret, taking your class. I always learn. So I think this is also a very good segue, because you mentioned about tensions, you mentioned local communities, you mentioned about accountability, and now I think this is a good segue for me to move to my left and invite Fabrizio for some of his reflections. Fabrizio has had a long, distinguished career, both World Bank, IMF, the Ministry
of Oversighting, with more transparency, and this is something that we request. We are pushing. I represent not only Italy, I represent 15 European countries, so this is a mandate, a very clear mandate that I got from my 15 authorities. To be more timely, the quality of the documentation, the quality of the project. So clearly these are elements which we are very much, and then also the efficiency of the use of the capital. We are looking, since nobody of our country in my constituency are borrowing country, so of course we are looking from a different angle, and the efficiency of the use of the capital is one of the points that we make, and we are very careful in monitoring. The bank, of course, is growing, and in growing the bank is growing the complexity of the bank activity, is also growing the complexity of what the board is doing and what we are expected to check. The dialogue with the management is very good. I think is appropriate with the level of difficulties that we can experience, not being in Beijing as a Reading board. But of course, the expectation is that we increase the oversight through the accountability framework that has been adopted and will be reviewed next year. Particularly, we are very, and I finish with this, we are particularly attached to the role of the CIU, which is the mechanism for the integrity mechanism of the bank. We are working for the revision of the PPM, and is an exercise. PPM is the way the complaints of local population, impacted people are coming to the bank. So we are working on that, and we are working how to improve the framework of the activity of CIU in order to have also better tool to exercise our side's activity. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio. With your permission, moving from the boardroom to the operational room, I think it'd be important to hear from my colleague, Rajat. Rajat manages an extensive portfolio of both private sector and public sector operations in South Asia, but also in East Asia country. And also, after a few years with the bank, I wanted to get your reflections, Rajat. How do you see the operating model, the structure that the bank has, the tools that the bank has available on both sides? What are the challenges? What needs adjustment? And a broader reflection on the operational side of the bank. Thank you.
Thanks, Alberto. So My first interaction with MDBs was in my earlier avatar, not when I was MD, as a client of including World Bank. And I was always struck by the rigorous due diligence process, even for the smallest transaction. And when I switched over, came to the other side, and that was pretty much early in AIIB days, what struck me was that, the policies, the rules we have put in place are exactly in line with what other MDBs follow. And so the question arises is that how are we trying to be different? So while, and what I have figured out over the years is that while our policies and the accountability mechanisms are quite similar, I think the key is in execution. How do we manage those? How do we deliver projects being more responsive to clients while upholding the same standards? And there have been many innovations in that. I think we have tried to experiment. If you look at the structure, for example, I can give you a couple of examples from the actual projects we did, like having public and private in the same teams. That's a unique experiment, because if you look at other institutions, they're actually very, very different teams or different organizations themselves. And that gives us a little more flexibility when you're interacting with clients. For example, there's a lot of clients are facing fiscal pressures. They have reached borrowing limits. The commodity prices are high. The external debt situation doesn't look too good. And so, there was a project we were wondering on how we can help the client borrow more and free up the borrowing capacity. And the idea we came up was, okay, if there are certain projects that have been completed and which carry a sovereign guarantee, why don't we just refinance them on a non-sovereign basis, get a club of commercial banks to come in and free up the sovereign side, which the country can then use to, let's say, more social type of expenditures like education, health, where private capital will not be forthcoming. So it serves two aims. First, the external debt situation is managed very well. Secondly, we could send a signal to the market and mobilize private capital. And so the entire refinancing was quite a success, and then now we are trying to replicate that in some other projects as well. And similarly, there are a lot of such examples. We put in place quickly, like other multilaterals, COVID relief facility during COVID times. But again, there were issues. How much could each member borrow? How much? Because there was a limit based on country size, capacity, and so on. And again, because if a member requested more, I know there are a couple instances, or it was not eligible then, but it still needed help. And so we could come up with how can we get our banking teams involved and run FI operation to support those members, to support the, say, MSMEs and infra projects and so on. And we did that very successfully in a few countries. So what I'm trying to say is, while the governance standards are the same as others, I think being smaller and being more nimble definitely gives us some advantages. Of course, from an operational point of view, I would say that we still do not have the complete repertoire of instruments that we would like to have. There's a lot of discussion around that, but I hope we will soon get there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rajat, for giving us this snapshot on how AIIB is doing an operation, both in private and public sector, and the challenges. I'd like to go a little bit more specific with my colleague, Shaolan. As you know, we have three areas that are pillars of our corporate strategy: climate finance and climate change and green finance. We have also connectivity, and the third one is private sector. Shaolan has had a lot of experience back in the World Bank, more than 20 countries, particularly promoting cross-border investments, cross-border connectivity. If we could hear from you in this particular challenge, how you see AIIB structuring itself, what are the challenges again and the opportunities for us? Thank you.
Thank you, Alberto. At first, I wanted to say, when I'm hearing Professor's 5 points, everything resonated extremely well. All the issues you talked about, the tension, the collaboration, the influence, MDB's mandate versus the country's sovereignty, and how you make sure the final beneficiary really receive whatever they deserve to receive, right? And through environment social, through procurement, through accountability, everything, it resonates extremely well, like Alberto introduced. By working with more than 20 countries, I always felt like one thing put a smile on my face whenever I travel extensively, but my daughter still think I'm a very cool mom, is because she heard the conversation we're having, how we bring the development impact to the agenda, and I hear all the stories we have on the ground. So I see the challenges, but I see tremendous opportunities. I always found out, this morning we heard Minister of Finance from Indonesia, Sri Mulyani, talks about, it's about the how-to, right? So we always know, client country knows what, but when it comes to how-to, they're really looking the solutions. So the key to me is my experience with all the challenges is, if we can always think we are part of the solution to extremely difficult development challenges. If we're part of that solution, we can always bring all the stakeholders together, be it at government level, minister level, and sector ministry, all the way down to local government to the beneficiary. So if we bring this common ground together, I always felt like it's doable. Alberto talks about some experience I have. I wanted to share. For example, I once worked and managed a regional connectivity operation in Central Asia, where we have 4 countries participate and 1 regional office to do. At that time, there even some countries even have some border dispute. So the challenge is definitely there. I always say, wow, I'm asked to do something to which make sure a marriage maybe doesn't have love, but make sure it works for a regional collaboration. It's very difficult, right? And because when I work with this hydromet service under the climate change agenda, they're extremely important because they're the one have all this data about be it weather, be it climate, but they all need to share information. So how do you make sure in that region they share information and then build from scratch the infrastructure, which is very difficult. So here comes the influence and capacity building and MDB can bring. I always tell them, let's not talk to the sky, let's talk to the people. Because you are the hydromet service people, you always get the data from sky, but we need to make sure all the users understand, end of the day, who are your users, who are your stakeholders, how you bring them together. So for that conversation, actually, it is about what it is MDB can bring the value to the table. And at the technical level, institution level, really help them to think through that. But at the same time, how we bring the countries together, it's not easy. But the how-to part, it's really to show, you find a way, like I said, I always feel like if I'm part of the solution, I recognize the challenges they're facing. And if we work with them, for example, when I started, it was extremely difficult to bring 4 countries together and 1 regional NGC. We bring them together to a field trip to learn from something. And then even every single hour, what kind of message needs to be delivered was carefully thought through. Is it because of financial sustainability? Is it because of data sharing among the countries? Is it about the user satisfaction? So every single slot was carefully managed. Towards the end of it, they say, we have 14 brothers from 4 Central Asia countries. Each country comes 4, 2 vice ministers, and 1 sister, which is me. Toward the end of the trip, right, we really built that the solidarity. We felt like, okay, here's all the problem. But through this trip, here's what we debate about. Here's what we learn about. One country's finance minister even told me, before I don't even know we have such an agency exists. Because it's so small, just doing the weather forecast, doing the, the hydro, even though it's so important, but not necessarily aware of it. But through this kind of engagement, through MDB as an enabler in a sense, but not someone talk down to them, right? It's rather somebody who come with a caring mind and a caring heart and really want to make changes. And like I always tell them, it's not we have the solution. You have the solution together with us to make these changes. So I just stop here to share the specific experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Shalan, for giving us, this very practical example of experience. We had in mind to go another round, but I really feel that would be interesting to hear from the public and your questions. I just have one more question for Professor Bradley, and then we open. If there is time, we can come back. You mentioned, in one of your 5 elements, the tensions. And as we see the world today, there is a tendency for us to think that these tensions have to be something bad. What are the preconditions or what are the elements to make those tensions to become a healthy tension? And a healthy tension so Fabrizio can navigate and help, the board decision. And we have, Rajat structuring and designing projects and Shaolan engaging directly. So the preconditions in the ecosystem so we have healthier tensions in what you said. Can you just comment on that before we thank you.
I mean, that's a critical question because the tensions will always exist. The tension between state sovereignty, even if states change, there will always be units that want sovereignty and the right to make their own decisions versus international organizations that have a mandate. I mean, managing those tensions is always a challenge. I think there have been moments in history where the world has done a better job of managing the tensions than they're doing now, or than we're doing now. In a way, it's what Shaolin said, is that you have to focus on a specific issue where there can be enough common area that you can say, we all recognize there's a problem here, we all want to solve the problem. We might have many other areas of disagreement. We put those aside and we focus on the one where we can work through it now and maybe build trust through that. I think the international norms and standards become very important, because I think that's the expression where the international community has come together and has said we all, or most of us, maybe it's not true that all of us, but most of us share enough common view of the particular problem that we can agree at least at a general principle level. We still have to work out how to implement those principles, and there's going to be lots of disagreements, but at least we've got a basis for doing that. And so that's, I think, as much as we can do.
Thank you, Danny, not only to give us some very practical suggestions and insights, but also some hope, which is very much needed at this time. So why don't we take some questions, and then if you could please identify yourself and if there's any particular panelist that you'd like to direct your question to.
Hello, my name is Radhika Goyal, and I am a policy associate with Accountability Council. We represent communities before independent accountability mechanisms across MDBs, and so this conversation has been really interesting and insightful for us as well. I just want to thank Daniel for raising the excellent points on the whole idea of MDBs and who their intended beneficiaries are and what effective accountability mechanisms look like. My colleague Kate and I want to also add that AIIB's decision to establish the PPM so close to the start of its operation was significant back in 2016, 2017. But since then, we've seen that the PPM has not been able to accept a single case despite all the financing that AIIB has done and despite well-documented environmental and social harms that Kate will be talking about. And this means impoverishment, this means gendered impacts, this means livelihoods being ruined, this means displacement. And this is not external to AIIB's development agenda. It's in fact at the heart of it, because if AIIB's financing is not helping its intended beneficiaries, then who is it really benefiting? Now, coming to the solution on how to fix it, and my question could be answered by Fabrizio, it could be answered by Shaolin. The AIIB is going to be reviewing its policy soon, and it's going to be reviewing its PPM policy. Can we expect that the review will be done in an independent, transparent, and consultative manner that actually allows affected communities to be a part of the conversation and allows communities to have access to the AIIB so that you are hearing their concerns. Thank you. I think Kate would like to add something.
Yeah, sorry to grab the microphone. My name's Kate Geary. I'm from Recourse, which is an organization that supports communities who have been affected by AIIB investments. We have produced a report which we can share with any of you if you're interested, trying to answer this question that Radhika just put. Why, after 7 years, $44 billion spent, more than 230 projects, why hasn't the AIIB accepted a single complaint from affected communities? And it's not just because you're doing a good job. We think there are other reasons for that. So when we looked at your portfolio, we found that nearly half of your projects are not even eligible for the accountability mechanism. That's because they're co-financed. No other MDB has that exclusion. You're the only one, so AIIB is an outlier there. And of those projects that are eligible, the majority of those, 56%, are through financial intermediaries like banks or private equity funds. Incredibly difficult for affected communities to find out that AIIB is financing that project and have access to the accountability mechanism. And then even when the communities do come to the PPM with a complaint, as they did over the gas power plant in Bangladesh called Bola, the communities had engaged with AIIB for 4 years, with management, with the local project developer, and yet when they finally complained to AIIB, their complaint was rejected because they had not engaged in good faith. And this is not acceptable for the communities. They need redress for harm suffered. So the question would be, how would you fix the accessibility crisis at the Project Affected Peoples mechanism? Thank you.
Perhaps we could take a few more questions and then we come back to our colleagues in the audience. Any other point or question? Yes, please.
Hello, I'm Khalid Ahmad. I'm from Egypt. I'm representing Telecom Egypt, one of the telecom companies in the market in Egypt and the Middle East. I want to ask, now you are pushing all the companies and the directions by European and most of the financial company, banking and lenders to have the same governance systems in each country. But you can consider that the local communities in Egypt or the poor companies in Middle East cannot reach to the same level of the governance requirements in Europe or in Asia. How you are requesting and putting this one on the community, okay, and on the governments and the companies or private sectors in these countries to have the same points that the European country which have already commitment which relating to the sustainability development more than our community. Our community is contributed for the problem of climate change with limited effect. My country is representing 0.6 of the global emissions from all the world, while there is high advanced countries contributes with high values. You are requesting us to make more hard work. It's affecting the communities, affecting the local companies, which is not able to afford it to invest or making more contributions, while we need your support in these situations. Are you going to put same level of governance contributions or governance accountability for all the countries? Thanks so much.
Thank you. Perhaps we could take these two questions, and if there is time, we open up even, and we can also continue the conversation outside. Let me just give an initial answer to my colleagues from the CSOs, and I think there are at least 3 dimensions that I can see in your question. One is a more systemic one. We're going to have the review, and I can assure you that in terms of, opening and also consulting, it's going to be built into the system. Second is that we don't have, the CIU head here, and so a question to them and a discussion and an interaction with them, I think would be very appropriate because it is an independent mechanism. So the third point is about the BOLA project. I think that deserves also a separate conversation and understanding, and was a decision at the end of the day from CIU itself, not management. Now, this all leads to some of the systemic questions that you very correctly asked, and I think this is very appropriate as part of the menu of items that should be evaluated during the review. I just want to recall, because it seems that everybody in the audience is very young, but when I was at the World Bank and working for the inspection panel, one of the perplexities that we had at the World Bank is that the World Bank inspection panel only had 1-2 projects a year. And why was that? So a lot of discussions, went to in trying to understand why communities were not coming, why, the redress was not coming. So I think it's an appropriate question, and we need to frame it in the context of the 21st century and the communications that we did not have 30 years ago. Also, the very specific mission of AIIB as being a bank with these 3 pillars, based in Asia, for Asia, and connectivity and climate change. So times have changed. So I think it's going to be a good opportunity for a good conversation and all this aspect. So we very much welcome this conversation. I think it's time. Thank you. So, Rajat, may I ask you to respond to our colleague from Egypt?
Okay. Probably, but before that, I'd just like to supplement one part on the financial intermediary part which you raised. And one of the reasons, when you look at the statistics, you must also understand that a lot of our projects also co-financed with other multilaterals in which their accountability mechanisms are followed. So it's not, that's one of the reasons probably you see low companies. But secondly, when you come to financial intermediaries and funds, it's, the world is debating right now on how can they mobilize private capital into development. And obviously, private equity funds, financial intermediaries are a very important part of mobilizing private capital into development. But it doesn't mean there's any dilution in those standards, because at all times there is a full line of sight into all underlying projects that are financed through those intermediaries. So if it's a question of how do we reach out better, then probably we'll have to, we can always engage on that, but there's no dilution as far as standards are concerned in terms of the actual implementation of the project.
Let me just ask Fabrizio to come in. Is that okay?
Yes. Thank you very much. And as you can imagine, on this question of the efficiency of the CIU and PPM board is extremely eager to have opportunity to engage management, and we already engage management in reconsidering some of the mechanisms, but also to have a CIU which is much more independent from the moment, as the CIU is now in the present situation. One consideration is who is looking at the organization chart of the bank should be aware that CIU, as Alberto was saying, is responding to the board, is the mechanism by which the board can exercise oversight on the activity. Sometimes having the CIU in the same line with other departments, it looks like from who is looking at from the external world, that seems that this mechanism is a part of the bank, which is not. It's not yet. Maybe we can do better also in the future. This is for sure something that we are looking at and considering.
Thank you, Fabrizio. I've been advised that we have 5 minutes, but I would like to ask Shaolan to come in, because when we think about conflict and accountability, we normally think about the higher level, the accountability mechanism. But as you have pointed out, it started, where the project, starts. So I'd actually want to make an intervention.
Thank you. I always feel like so lucky and privileged working as staff in the MDB. It's because the first day I can go to the countryside, talk to a farmer about what's his situation he faced, no irrigation, right? And the next day I can meet the Minister of Water Resources to tell him what exactly. So the kind of issues upstream from very beginning, what could be the very effective intervention from the first start consultation. And then you bring them idea to our project design. So that's the first one. Secondly, now I'm responsible as the manager for operation policy and the quality assurance. Every single project in AIIB, before they go to the board, we actually review it. We have different kind of review in the system. So for example, my unit, we specifically look at this GRM system, this grievance redress. We make sure every single project would have that. We would also ask question, what kind of language you put there, right? Sometimes those ethnic minorities, whether this GRM system is effective to be put in place. So this is something actually during the project preparation, our team, like from Rajesh's team, are looking at, but from my team, we actually evaluate to make sure we ask questions to say, did you go out to talk to someone? Is this something you put into place? And during the project implementation, we have our internal monitoring system. They also report on those things, whether it's working, have they look at those books, to say whether there's incident reporting, have you addressed it? When we review again those reports, internal reports, we also ask those questions. We have 500 staff, so every 200 project, not every single project I can say is perfect, but this is a system we put in place and really try to address it from upstream all the way through implementation.
Well, thank you very much. I am told we have now 1 minute, and we have another panel coming through the door. So, and they are already waving at me. So let me thank all of you for being here this afternoon. I'm sure there's a lot of things that we can be, to be continued, box. Let me thank Danny, Shaolan, Fabrizio, Rajat, for being part of the panel today. And obviously Kishore Lay for putting this together since our times in Beijing. So thank you so much. Thank you all.